Tonight we're going to talk about the proposed final budget for the next school year. Some quick agenda items I think that we're going to cover here, as we do pretty much every year. We're going to go through some budgeting obstacles. I'm going to run through the changes in the current proposed final budget versus what we had in the preliminary budget back in November. We'll go over year-to-year changes in revenues and expenses, and then we'll look at, of course, the tax impact and then the next steps. So some obstacles that we have, which we always do about this year, about this time of year, is the state budget. We don't know where that's going to land. The governor, of course, had put forth his preliminary budget back in the February-March timeframe, but of course those numbers are not yet final, and probably don't expect them to be until sometime in late June, if late June. And of course, the numbers that get impacted there are a number of subsidies, as you can see listed there. Another area is in the federal spending of grants, which is a small part of our budget, but still a part of the budget just the same. Title awards haven't been communicated to us yet. So typically we would get those in the June-July timeframe. But we do make estimates based on past. So let's take a quick look at the changes that we've had since the preliminary budget back in November, which this board voted on in January. So these are some of the items I had. So the budget books coming back from the various departments and building budgets, we reduced that gap, the original gap, by about $460,000. Additionally, the rate change from the original assumptions that we had for PSERS, a drop from 34% to 33.9%, so that saved about almost $400,000. We decreased the budgetary reserve, and we didn't actually decrease the budgetary reserve. We decreased the amount we're going to increase the budgetary reserve, which is something we talked about last spring as potentially having that be a percentage of the overall budget, not just a flat number of $300,000 as it had been for a number of years. Perhaps this isn't the year to do that, but we certainly have it on our radar to do in the future. For special education, there was an increase of almost $1.6 million on top of what was budgeted in the prelim budget. And a lot of that, of course, has to do with the age increase from 21 to 22. That's pushing closer to $1 million at this point. And of course, increased number of move-ins to the district and added services that are required for some of our special ed students. We also had, and you'll see, of course, on the agenda tonight, the CBA, which was negotiated, the meet and discuss benefit plans for various groups, the admin, the secretaries, custodians, and food service groups. Those added overall about net of some other changes, about 1.4 for this year. We decreased the debt service increase. Again, as a number we wanted to move up to. Inflation is ever growing, as we know, so we know that at some juncture we will need to increase our debt service portion of our budget to cover those types of increases as we go forward. We did reduce that number. And then we also reduced our estimate for workers' compensation by about 210. And that's basically due to the good work of the safety committee headed up by Mrs. Lease. On the revenue side of the ledger, Mrs. David Heiser and I are constantly looking at our money management for our investments and such. And in doing so, we were able to increase that by about 1.3. A lot of this goes back to what happens at the Fed. If you recall, the beginning of the year, I should say the tail end of last year, they were calling for potentially 5 rate decreases this year. Now we're down to maybe 2, and the chatter I'm hearing is maybe none. So long as that doesn't happen, our rates will stay at a higher level, and of course that'll increase our earnings. A word of caution always is, this is economically driven, so that is not going to be the number going forward, into the future. So we have made provisions in our long-term plan, obviously, to compensate for that. State subsidies estimate, an increase of about $300,000. That's taking 50% of what Governor Shapiro's preliminary budget was. After looking at and speaking with a number of other CFOs, business managers in our area, I could see that some were taking none, some were taking half, and a very, very small number were taking all. And the chatter that I've gotten back is that we're going to get some of it, but we're not getting all of it. So 50% looked like a good marker. And then, of course, because our PSERS overall dollars have increased, a small reduction in monies that we had set aside that was committed for that purpose by the board in years past. So if we look at those changes, our proposed gap back in the preliminary budget was about almost $8.5 million. Then we had, of course, the revenues we just talked about, reducing that. The expense changes increased that a little bit, so we're sitting at just under $7 million as a final budget gap currently. Now I'd like to take a quick couple of minutes to talk about year over year and things that have changed. Remember that what we just talked about was just preliminary budget. Now let's look at budget to budget from year to year. So as is typically true, you can see from the slide that we are heavily funded by local sources. 78% is funded by local sources, about 21% by the state, and about 1% from the Fed, of course, where all the things are told that we have to do. So when we look at the local side, we look at real estate tax, and basically it's based on organic growth, which means increased assessments in our area, whether that's new builds or interim assessments, someone adds a swimming pool, that type of thing. But we're looking at organic growth there without doing anything of about $2.5 million. Our earned income tax and our real estate transfer taxes, as I repeatedly speak about in the Finance Committee, are overperforming, and they continue to overperform. So that's an increase of about 1.3. I spoke about earned interest, something we were able to do from numbers I already had baked into the model, but when I look at a year over year, it's about a $900,000 increase in interest earnings year over year in the budget. And then all the others about 400. Then for the state side, we're looking at, for the basic ed and the special ed, it's an increase to the budget year over year of about $750,000. That's some monies that we hadn't budgeted last year, plus some monies that we're looking to budget this year, kind of increasing that. Our Ready to Learn, there's no change there. I haven't seen that change in years. It's been flat for quite some time. Looking at the transportation subsidy, and it's basically due to an increased cost profile, there's actually going to be a drop there, we feel, of about $270,000 based on recent trends and some other factors that go into that. And then the PSERS and the FICA subsidy, it's really due to higher wage growth because you got to spend more to get more. That's an increase of almost $940,000. On the federal side, we'll see a decrease there because we're winding out of the COVID dollars, the COVID spend. So when we look at all that side by side, that's what it looks like. We're looking at a total of about $195.6 million in total revenue. And then other sources, the $1.5 million includes the piece of the PSERS reserve that I had mentioned earlier, plus a piece of the curriculum reserve, which I'll get into a little bit more when we talk about the expense side of things. So the number that always interests me when I look at these comparatively is I like to look at that right-hand column where it says 3.2%. So organically, our revenues are growing at about a 3.2% rate. I think we kind of know where the inflation rates are, and of course, that's impacting a lot of things on the expenditure side of the budget. So when I look at this, and again, we're talking about a lot of different things here, but we're talking about the funding for all programs for next year, including some of those agreements that I mentioned that are on the agenda for approval tonight. So typically, we're in the 67% of the total budget 67 to 70% is personnel wages and benefits, not just the wages, but also the benefits. So when I look at the overall, what I'm looking at about is there's about a $4.7 billion increase year over year, and it's comprised of those two components. One, of course, has to do with the collective bargaining unit agreement, which is on the budget tonight, and another piece of it, of course, has to do with general increases and the agreements with those other three groups, the admin, the secretaries, and the custodial groups. Food service is actually on a different budget, so that's not included in here, which is smaller compared to everything else. The taxes and benefits side, an increase of about $2.3 million. We are expecting the PSERS cost to increase about $1.5 million, despite there being a drop in the rate. However, the overall gross wage number is increasing, and that's how you get to a higher cost there. Medical coverage, an increase of about 424,000. This is a number, I will tell you, we are still reviewing. As I mentioned, in finance, we did get our consultants' numbers back. They were higher than we expected them to be, and therefore those are not included in the number right now, as I wanted to have a little bit more time to review that. And then payroll taxes due to the higher wages of about $360,000. So, and then for non-personnel related expenditures, a total of about $6.5 million. And I think really what's going on here is we're now starting to feel the pain of the inflation that's been around for the past number of years. If we do a collective look at, and I call it inflation stacking, the cumulative effect of inflation increases over the years. Over the past 3 years, it's been close to 17 or 18% if you add the numbers. We're seeing a very similar pattern. We're just seeing it stacked on the back end more than we did see it on the front end. One of the big drivers, of course, is this special education. Again, we talked about the age increase from the 21 to the 22, which is going to be a big factor that wasn't in this budget that we now have to pay for and prop it up for the next coming budget. So that's almost a double whammy. Then we also have, of course, as I mentioned, move-ins and services and et cetera, those types of things. Because of the larger number that we looked, myself, Dr. Giambattista, and Amy Hiller, one of our special ed supervisors, sat down and looked at the special education budget line by line, detail by detail, starting with every student that we know we have in our program, looking at their needs, from a financial perspective, and coming up from the ground floor to build up what the number was. And that's the increases that we came up with, and setting aside, of course, a smaller amount, or an amount, at least an estimated amount, for any increases that we might see coming forward. Curriculum, about $1.2 million. However, that's offset by what is in the long-term curriculum plan reserve. So while there's an increase there on the expense side, there is an equal increase on the revenue side. So that kind of cancels each other out. And then the other ones are, obviously by looking at them, they're somewhat smaller. Transportation is an indicated cost we knew we were going to have, and also with the fuel that goes along with that. So when I look at those numbers side by side, again, this is what we're looking at. So on the salaries and benefits side, so personnel costs, you're talking about overall growth there of about 5.5%, inclusive of the agreements that are on the agenda for approval this evening. When you look at everything below that that is non-personnel related, again, back to the inflation items, we're talking about an 8.6%, which is, again, back-ending the stacking of inflation over the past few years. Again, analytic number that I look for is the one all the way to the bottom right, which is 7.1%. We compare that to the 3.2% we saw on the revenue side, we can see the disconnect, right? So what does that look like overall? Overall, we're talking about revenues just under $196 million and expenses of about $204. Transferred from committed funds from PSERS, which I spoke about before, of $150, $150,000, and from the curriculum reserve about $1.3. for a total gap of 6,969, which would equate to a tax impact, at least currently, this is not the final budget, this is the final proposed, still working on it, 5.36% versus the Act 1 index of 5.3%. So clearly, still work to do. The difference, by the way, just so everyone's clear, in that 6 basis points is about $80,000 to get us down to the index level. I call this next slide the Abby Deerdorf slide because it shows, you were going to ask, right? I know you were going to ask. It shows, well, what's the impact of all that? So 1% in real estate tax change is approximately $1.3 million. Or if you look at it, it's about $30.88 per $100,000 assessed, right? If you're looking at a 5.36 tax increase, which is over the index, so we're going to bring that down, you're looking at approximately $165 per year for a $100,000 assessment. If you have a $200,000 assessment on your home or your property, then it would be obviously double that. At the 5.3 or the index level, that is about 164. So it's not a big change, but a small change there. And then, of course, you could see what it looks like on a month-to-month basis if you were inclined to boil it down farther. So what are the next steps? Well, obviously, the first of the next steps is to adopt the proposed final, which is on the agenda tonight. You can see I wrote it's a checkbox because we have to do it kind of by law if we're going to achieve our target of approving a final budget at the end of May. We need a 30-day window from the adoption of the proposed final to the adoption of the final. There's work to be done, right? But on May 8th or earlier, we'll make the proposed final budget available for public inspection on the PDE Form 2028. That'll be on our website. We'll also have a copy at the district office if someone wants to come in and look at it. On May 14th, we have our Finance Committee meeting, at which time we will be looking to close the gap that we have and look at any other possible changes that we may have. On May 18th or earlier, we'll publish notice to intent to adopt the final budget and target date May 28th to do the adoption of the final budget for next year, giving my department and the tax collectors time to get their paperwork done so we can get the bills out by July 1st, which we're supposed to do by law as well. And with that, I'm happy to take any comment or questions.
Thank you, Mr. Fink. As Mr. Jackson was alluding, we appreciate all the work that goes into this presentation, even knowing that this is just, in many ways, a check the box to be able to get to the final vote in May. We still appreciate all the work that you and your team do to provide an update to the board with regards to where we're at. So, granular question, and I know that it was alluded to in the presentation on the expense side, but we've talked a lot about healthcare costs in Finance Committee, and you've been regularly updating us with commentary from Ruskini with regards to what's driving some of the claims. And this isn't just for this year, but I remember that going back multiple years on the Finance Committee. So I'm just curious. I've seen neighboring school districts kind of getting creative with regards to trying to manage healthcare costs, trying to control what we can control. Is that something that you and your team and the administrators have been talking about? Because this is not a problem that's going to go away anytime soon.
Yeah, we look at a number of possibilities. I speak very frequently with Mrs. Lease and Mr. Rizzo to go over potential plans for controlling stuff, whether those are, we don't really want to do anything drastic to our plans. Obviously, because they're a big component of why people are here. But we do look at some other possibilities and things that we maybe have working in the works. They may not be short-term fixes, but I'm a long-game player anyway. So I don't want to disclose too much without knowing enough at this time.
No, but I mean, it just gives me confidence in that you guys are thinking long game as it relates to this, because we can't just go year by year in budget. I hear you say that. I took that from you, Mr. Fink.
Yeah, that's correct.
We can't budget year to year.
Can't budget year to year. You gotta go way out.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Any questions or additional comments from the board?
Thank you very much for that. And echoing, yes, I know how much work goes into this for you and your staff. A question, and this may have to be answered like at the finance meeting, regarding the estimated basic education and special ed. A couple of years ago, I think it was not the budget we're under now, but the previous year, we received more from the state than was anticipated. Many schools did. There was a correction that was done. And we ended up, and this is line 7111 and 7271 of our budget, by the way. The state allocated us actually almost $1 million more than we had anticipated. Could you please explain with the information that you receive from your sources, how you feel as we're going to fall? Will there be any, do you feel confident that your estimates will be closer, or is there still hope that the state may come through with additional funding, or where we are with that? Thank you.
Yeah, I haven't heard, thanks for the question. I haven't heard any chatter about going over what Governor Shapiro had put forth. In fact, the chatter that I have heard is, as I said, you'll see some of that, but not all of that. Now, that was a little while ago, but I certainly haven't heard anything about going over that number like we saw happen, what was it, 2 years ago or something like that. I do believe that taking a 50% piece of that is probably a pretty good, safe bet. I wouldn't recommend going too far with that number. And I'll speak from experience and say, because I have gone too far with that number before and got burned. So I'm not comfortable going really beyond that number. Again, my professional advice.
I have one additional question. So I looked at we're looking at that 5.3 index, and if we look at the last 10 years, the average index for spring forward, that the Act 1 index has been 2.67%, which obviously this year, when the indexes have gotten higher as the years have progressed, so we would expect not to be anywhere near 2.67. But the 10-year tax increase for spring forward is 2.37 if we remove it in the outliers. But anyway, following the trend of the last 10 years, with the 5.3 index, we could expect an increase of our taxes of 4.7 if we remove the outliers, because there was 1 year in which we did a 0% increase, and this past year we actually did a 4.1, which was high. It would be 4.3. So with that would be based on our 10-year trend for our tax increases, where it would be. Can you talk to me about, in the community, about what we're doing to try and get that? I know 5.3 is the Act 1 index, but with these increases that you've talked about, what we're doing to try and keep within that trend number that we've had experienced for the last 10 years.
Sure, and I think the real issue comes down to is, outside circumstances, things that are not in our control. And the big one that the averages over there that did not contemplate was that 17% in stacking inflation. Back in the early part of the years you reference, inflation was less than 1%. So really, the increases were not necessarily happening on or at least the major part weren't really happening on the non-personnel related things. They were happening more on the personal related things based on agreements and, folks with raises and that type of stuff. But typically, if I recall correctly, and I'm just going off the top of my head, we've seen, it even in those times, we saw expense increases of around, I'm going to say somewhere between 3% and 4% each year, even though inflation was low. So I think then when you stack on that, the last few years of inflation, which is now impacting all our hard goods, I think that's a number that's really driving the number. And in all honesty, I don't think I can control that. I don't think we really have a good lever to control that piece.
So doesn't the and thank you for that, and I don't disagree with you, but doesn't that 5.3% index, which is the highest that we've ever seen, take inflation into consideration based on, and I'm not sure everybody knows what that number is based on, so.
Yeah, it takes a number of things into consideration. Inflation is certainly one of them, but as you can see, if we've been If we were at, I forget what it was, 3.4 2 years ago, I think we were at 4.1 last year and 5.3 this year, you can see there is an increase there. But you can also see that it's not increased at inflationary levels. We were talking about 6 to 7% 2 years ago because it's a trailing indicator is really why. It also takes into account across Pennsylvania what wages look like, which are now starting to catch up with the inflation that's taken place over the past few years. So a lot of things are being inflation driven in that respect. Thought just popped right out of my head. I hate when that happens. Getting old, right? Getting old. So I'm going to leave it at that.
Right. And thank you for that information. Again, I really do appreciate it. I do hope that.
I remember what it was. See that? You sparked it. And I don't know how because it's unrelated. But no, but one thing that I also know is, based on, again, this is a number that comes out in September timeframe, which is when the index number comes out in that fall, the fall window, right? They came out with a 5.3, right? We talked about that. They also estimated that the following year was going to be 4. And that was still when they thought they were going to have 5 rate reductions. I would bet dollars to donuts that number is going to go up again next year because inflationary levels, while they're better, it's still inflation on top of inflation on top of inflation. And that's a big piece of the driver.
Yeah, and before I defer over to Mr. Jackson, just to reiterate that, when we talk about the trend in the Act 1 index, right, that number is calculated every single year, right? It's not based on 10-year data of where we are from an economic standpoint, because if you look at 2010 to 2020, as you mentioned, we were in a bull market, we were in a near zero interest rate environment, very low inflationary environment, and then 2020 hit and we started to see that number creep up to where it is today. So it is very deliberate as to why, and as you mentioned, there's a lot of things in the market that are outside of our control that dictate what that number is, and that number is a cost of doing business. That's why the state sets it where it is, because if you look at what Springford has done, and we even can take last year, Springford was very much in line with a lot of the neighboring school districts, right? This is not a Springford issue. This is a systemic issue with regards to public education. Mr. Jackson?
I would just like to finish my one last statement.
I'm sorry, I didn't know that you were done.
That's
Go
okay.
ahead.
I just wanted to say that I appreciate the efforts put forward as we as a board are certainly our number one reason that we're here is to look out for our students and their education, but also to be stewards of the taxpayers' money. And there are times perhaps that we need to tighten our belts and cut other things that we would like to have had in order to get the number to a place where in maybe a different year we would be able to do. So that's what I'm just my feelings on it. But thank you very much for all your work.
There are a lot of action items on the agenda today. If there's something that one should feel free to vote no. Mr. Jackson, go ahead.
Since I've been on the board for over 8 years, I can speak to some of Dr. Wright's issues. I think in 2009, this district had a deficit of $12.9 million, and those boards had to work within those parameters. It is almost impossible to do comparisons because what those boards might have addressed or did not address, we're having to address now. So it is easy to sit here and say, why aren't we doing what they did back then? Well, there's not a direct comparison item by item, cost by cost that you can do to say there's a trend. Further to that point, this budget is talked about in the finance meeting every month. It is talked about what has been spent for the month. We project what the projected increase will be. This here just an accumulation of all of that data into this report. So as far as tightening the belt, as I mentioned last month and the month before, IT and curriculum, right now I think there has been $2.5 million on the table. There's $1.3 million as part of that 2.5. So if you want to, as you guys like to say, cut, you don't cut because you're just kicking the can down the road. If you want to do a true analysis of this, you determine what you can do without. That is proper budget management. And with that, I will seal.
Thank you. And I also want to defer to Mr. Lackey and Mrs. Goldsmith online. I apologize. I should have probably deferred to Zoom first. But is there any commentary that you would like to make before we proceed?
No, I just want to thank Mr. Fink for all his work and the Finance Committee for, spending the time and the attention to detail to make this as palatable as possible.
Thank you.
I didn't have anything further, but again, I echo Dave's sentiments. I have had questions since my time on the board, and I've reached out to Mr. Fink, and he has been more than responsive and answered them, very timely, and I appreciated it.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay. Any other questions? Thank you, Mr. Fink. Appreciate it.